Great to be here. Hopefully we'll get this video going. It's an 18-minute video that is kind of an overview of what the situation is in Ukraine is about from my perspective. And obviously there's a lot of different perspectives when it comes to this issue. And I don't know how many of you have followed any of this about Ukraine or where you get your information from, because of course a lot of what we think depends on what source of news we're looking at. But let me just ask a couple of questions to get a sense of where you're at. If you could raise your hand if you followed the news about a missile going into Poland. Wow, a lot of you did. Okay. Well, let me start there because it's an example of what could happen in this conflict. So far, it'll be a year come February 24th that the Russians invaded. And it's been a brutal conflict with many people killed. We have no idea the numbers. You know, when these wars happen, there are so many different statistics that are put out about how many people are killed. Oftentimes the parties they want to lower the numbers to make it look like that. Not that many people are being killed. So we don't know. But we know that there are over 10,000 people on each side that have been killed. Some places they talk about 100,000. And we know that for the Ukrainian people, this has been brutal, that millions of them have had to flee the country, that a new tactic that the Russians are using is destroying the infrastructure of Ukraine so that people are left with a winter coming on without electricity, without heating, without water in some cases. And then on the side of it's not just the innocent people in Ukraine, it's also all of the soldiers that are being killed. And when I was young, there was a draft around Vietnam, and so people your age, particularly the men in this room, would be sent off to fight. In the case of Ukraine, it's mandatory for people over 18, men to fight. And in the case of Russia, there's now new conscripts that have been called up. And so these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are doing the fighting and the dying. And I doubt that many of them want to be involved in this conflict. And of course, there's the parents who've lost their children who can't find out what happened to them, especially in Russia. So a lot of suffering going on. The conflict, I tend to look at it on two levels. One is there was a civil war in Ukraine that has been going on that hopefully will get this going, and you can learn more about what that was all about, where Russia came in and is the aggressor. And that is the war happening in an area called the Donbass. On top of that is a geopolitical conflict where the U.S. has been fighting, trying to expand its hegemony and seeing the Cold War that happened with Russia as really a geopolitical war that's going on in the region as well that has complicated this, and it's important to understand that aspect of it as well, because that's where we in the U.S. come in. Many people say that this is a conflict that the Ukrainians can win, meaning kicking out the Russians, recovering all of the land that was taken, including all of the Donbass and Crimea. But people in the U.S. military who understand more of what's going on in the ground, especially Biden's chief advisor, who is the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have said that this is a war that cannot be won on the ground, that Russia is not going to give up the territory that it has, and that this really is a war that could either expand into a nuclear war, or as we saw with that missile in Poland, expand to more countries getting involved in this war, and it could really become another world war, or it has to be negotiated at the negotiating table. And so that's really the crux of it, is how long will this war continue to go on with so much suffering, so many people dying? Or will there be much more of a push both on the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, and the European and the US side to actually move towards negotiations? So where is that push right now? When it comes to Russia, there is a lot of censorship in the press, so many people don't know what's going on. But despite that, there is more and more opposition within Russia to this war. When Russia called up 300,000 new reservists, many of the young people, hundreds of thousands, left the country because they didn't want to fight. There is a lot of nationalism inside Ukraine, where they want to get every inch of their territory back. But polls that have been taken in Ukraine show a shift in that as well. In fact, the people that are in the areas that are most affected by the war are the ones that are most anxious to see negotiations start. And then is the issue of Europe, because Europe really is suffering a lot because of this war. The sanctions that have been put on energy coming from Russia, and much of Europe was dependent on that Russian energy, are now facing a situation where they're having to scramble to get that energy replaced from other sources. And what it means is that the price of energy has gone way up. And one of the places where they're getting that energy is from the United States, and specifically right here in Texas, where there are the gas and oil companies recognizing that this is an opportunity for them to fill in the gaps created by the sanctions on Russian energy. But what Europeans are saying is that in the US companies are price gouging, are profiteering from the war, and are selling the energy at 4 times the price that people in this country are paying for it. And so there is a lot of complaining in Europe about how this war is affecting their standard of living. It's affecting the ability of the manufacturing sector to keep going because of the high energy prices that they're all paying. So in Europe, you're seeing people coming out into the streets in protests in many different countries. They're protesting against inflation. They're protesting against the higher costs of groceries, of energy. But they're also protesting against the war in Ukraine, connecting these issues. Meanwhile, here at home, there's not a long attention span in this country to things like foreign policy. And so while we heard a lot about the issues of Ukraine in the early days, there's not as much in the US press. Nevertheless, the press tends to take a position saying that this war can be won on the battlefield. And so there are a lot of people in this country that think that it's a good thing to keep sending more and more weapons into Ukraine to help them win. Now, there are polls that have been asking a question that I want to ask you, which is, first let me say, the amount of money that's being spent on Ukraine, if this next amount of $37 billion is approved, which it looks like it certainly will be over $100 billion that the US taxpayers have spent in less than 1 year. So a question that's asked in the polls is the US doing too little to help Ukraine? Is it doing just enough to help Ukraine? Or is it doing too much to help Ukraine? And so let me just put that out here to see where you all feel on this issue. If you could raise your hand for one of those three things. So is the U.S. doing too little to help Ukraine? Is the U.S. doing the right, just the right amount to help Ukraine? Is the U.S. doing too much to help Ukraine? So it looks like people are either don't know or are more between the doing just the right amount and doing too much. Yeah.
Yeah, I got a question. What about if you, doing something in the part of not having the war?
So negotiating, pushing for negotiations. So raise your, I'm going to ask two, you get two choices here. If you think it's possible to negotiate with Russia, and if you think that's not possible. So do you think it's possible to negotiate with Russia? Do you think it's not possible? So that's interesting. We get more people on the possible than the not possible, but let me give you my opinion on that. Right after the war started, there was a call to end this quickly. And the academic studies show that the best time to end a war is right after it began, that in the first month. It's more possible than as the war drags on, it becomes harder and harder. And so in the first month, there was a big push by the United Nations Secretary General, and the mediator was the head of state of Turkey. And they started negotiations, and it seemed like they were actually getting somewhere. There was a 15-point plan that they were looking at, and one of the key things was Ukraine going to give up its desire to be part of NATO. And at that point, Zelensky had said that he recognized that it was going to be impossible for Ukraine to be a NATO country, that it would have to be neutral. And the negotiations were pushing forward on a number of different issues. Well then, and we explain this in the video, it seems like the head of the UK at that time, Boris Johnson, and the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, got involved and pushed Ukraine not to negotiate and said, you can really win this. You don't have to compromise. And that has been a position since then. When I speak to groups, I find a lot of people like you who said, well, Russia's the aggressor. They want to take over all of Ukraine. You can't negotiate with them. And specifically, you can't negotiate with Putin, that he is he's a dictator. He wants to rebuild the old Soviet empire, and that he's totally untrustworthy. And I want to point out, one, those negotiations were going forward and were making progress, and both sides had said they were making progress before they were scuttled. Two, there are a lot of talks that are going on between Russia and Ukraine on specific issues. For example, the world did not really know before this war began how dependent so many countries were on grain coming from Russia and Ukraine. That 40% of the grain exported, particularly wheat, but other grains as well, were critical to feed people in Africa and the Middle East. And so when the war started, there was an increased shortage of food, and a great pressure to try to make an agreement to get that grain out. And an agreement was reached to create a land corridor inside Ukraine to get that wheat out and create the corridor in the sea to get that out as well. And that has been successful. And it means that over 10 million tons of grain has gotten out of Ukraine to places that really desperately need that. Another example is, and let's see if you, and how many of you heard about the fighting that was going on very close to the largest nuclear plant in Ukraine called Zaporizhia. Did you hear about that? So at that time, there was a terrible sense of doom that this plant was going to explode, and that radiation would then not only go through Ukraine, but to Russia and other countries in Europe as well. And so there was a lot of pressure to put on the Russians to make a deal with Ukraine and the International Atomic Energy Association to get representatives of that association into the plant to try to stop the fighting that was going on right around the plant. And those negotiations have gone forward. There have been representatives of the international agency inside the plant. And it is still not a safe situation, but it's much better than it was. Another example of talks that have been going on are prisoner swaps. And we don't hear about them much in the media, but there have been probably almost 20 prisoner swaps. And some of them including large numbers of prisoners, like hundreds of them. And so I think it's important to just think about how difficult it is to arrange even one prisoner swap in a war situation where there's no trust between the different sides, how logistically difficult it is. And this has been done almost twice a month since the fighting began. My point is to say that it is possible to talk. And the talks have to extend beyond those specific issues to how we're going to solve the problem. Then the issue is not just talks between Ukraine and the Russians, but also between the US/NATO and Russia. And what kind of talks could there be around that? Well, groups like mine that want to see an end to this war have been pushing for the Biden administration and Biden himself to talk to Putin. We've also been calling for our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, to talk directly to his counterpart in Russia, because that's what diplomats are supposed to do. You're supposed to talk to your adversaries. But those talks have not started. What we do see is that there have been talks between other US officials and their counterparts in Russia, and that is the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, and the National Security Council. Now, what we've been told is that they are not talking about how to end this war. They've been talking about how to stop this war from expanding, how to stop it from a nuclear war, how to stop it from a situation where the NATO countries are directly involved, like what happened when that missile went into Poland, which is a NATO country. So that's where the talks are. But it doesn't stop the ongoing fighting that's happening. So the US position has been Ukraine has to decide for themselves if and when they want negotiations, that we are not going to pressure them. But I think we should dig into that a little further, because the US is the one that's providing most of the weapons for this war. The US is the one that's providing over $1 billion every month just to keep the Ukrainian government going, because their economy has crashed. And so the US has a lot of, has a lot to say about how this conflict moves forward. And so, in my opinion, I feel that if the US said, we do not have a blank check to keep this war going endlessly, that would be a signal to the Ukrainians that they have to start negotiations. So in this country, in the US, there is a Democrat in the White House. The administration has so far not said that it wants to negotiate an end to this war. And in Congress, you have both the Democrats and the Republicans, for the most part, who have been very supportive of the war in Ukraine and willing to allocate lots of US money for that war. But there have been voices on the left and the right that have started to question this. On the right, in the Republican Party, there were 57 members of the Republican Party that voted against the big tranche of money, $40 billion, that was going to Ukraine. And some of them had reasons that I don't know if you in this room would agree with. Some of them said we should put that money into securing our border with Mexico. Some of them said we should put that money into our real adversary, which is China. But some of them said we have unmet needs at home, and we should be taking care of those unmet needs and not giving all this money to a war in Europe that the Europeans should figure out how to solve. On the Democratic side, there were 30 members of the progressives in Congress, including one from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, who signed a letter to Biden saying that in addition to the support that they were giving Ukraine, it looked like this is a time to really push for negotiations. Well, when they put out that letter, there was a lot of backlash from within the Democratic Party leadership saying, how can you second guess what the administration is doing? We have to all be on the same page as Democrats and let the Biden administration be the one to take the lead. And so within 24 hours of putting out that letter, they backtracked. They walked it back. And now I think there are very few members on the Democratic side who have been willing to put their voice out there to call for negotiations. There is one, for example, from California. His name is Ro Khanna. He had signed that letter, and he stood by the letter, and he actually got on CNN and made a case for it, saying that I think it's totally rational to be saying that we need to push for negotiations. And he got a lot of support for keeping that position, whereas other Democrats felt with the pressure that they wanted to retract their signatures on that letter. There are other people who are calling for negotiations. Donald Trump, for example, when he goes out in his rallies or in his social media, or when he gave his speech that he was going to run for president again, he always brings up the war in Ukraine. And he said, this could lead to a third world war. It could annihilate life on this planet. We have to negotiate. And were I in power, I would be talking to Putin and we would find a way to end this war. Now, some people might snicker and say, well, you know, he talks a good line. He wouldn't do that. You can't trust him, whatever. But people who hear him talk like that, there is a lot of support for that. And he says, when you get the Biden in power, you get war. If I came in, you would get an end to that. And I bring this forward because this is a political issue. And there are people now who are staking out their position and trying to get public support for it. The same you see on the cable news programs. The majority of them have not given voice even to people like myself calling for negotiations. They have had a steady stream of people who have been saying more or less the same thing. The Ukrainians can win if we give them more high-powered weapons, if we just keep increasing the funding that's going to them. But there are other people, for example, Tucker Carlson on Fox News, that have a very different position and are calling for negotiations. So it's a strange political configuration right now when you have people who are on the right of the Republican Party, fighting with their own more centrist members of the Republican Party. And you have people on the left of the Democratic Party who have been cowed into not being vocal about their call for negotiations. And then you have us, the American people. And here's where I feel it's important to talk about people getting involved, because I think that if we can build up more of a call for an end to this war from the base, whether it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever it is, in this country, we will be getting more support from our elected officials, and we could have a chance to help end this war sooner than later. And so that's why I wrote the book, did the video that it looks like you'll not see, and have been traveling around the country trying to get people involved. And I think what we'll do now is I'll open it up for a discussion to see what you agree with what I've said, what you don't agree with, what other issues have come up for you around this war that you'd like us to talk about, and anything else that you would like to discuss. Yes?
During the Iraq War, there were a lot of different peace groups out there, and so where are they now, and where are they standing on this issue?
Well, that's a great question. During the Iraq War, we were able to get large numbers of people out into the streets. Hundreds of thousands of people came out to the streets several times. In fact, there was one mobilization in New York City that was called the largest mobilization in US history against a war. And what happened there is that when that was under George Bush, when Obama came in, a lot of those people thought Obama was going to end the wars, and so they kind of fizzled out. But the other thing that happened is that people became disillusioned, because when you come out on the streets time and time again to stop a war and the government doesn't listen to you, and in the case of Iraq, went ahead and invaded anyway, people start questioning, is this a tactic that makes sense? Can we stop the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about in the early 1960s? Can you really stop them when they've made their determination that they're going to launch a war? So I think, and another reason is that people got involved in other issues where they thought they could have more of an impact. They saw the existential crisis of the climate facing this planet and got more involved in that. And especially young people who care about the future of life on this planet and thought that they could make a difference on many different levels, getting even their university to have electric cars, or, all kinds of things you could do in your city, rather than protesting wars thousands of miles away when the government usually doesn't listen. So it's been very difficult to build up an anti-war movement. And in fact, I would say the most solid people in the anti-war movement are older people like myself that come from the Vietnam War days. And young people now have no history of, no connection to Vietnam War. And even the Iraq War is a distant memory for people who are in college at this point. And I think for many people, because they grew up when the US was at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's sort of like the norm. Like there's this low-grade fever or cancer or something going on in the background there, and people don't see how it affects them. But it's important to talk about how it does affect everybody. And I would say especially young people. Certainly there is the possibility of a nuclear war. And I find that young people it doesn't really compute that much with young people because they don't have a history of the kind of drills we used to have in school where you'd have to hide under your desk and and any memory of the U.S. actually using a nuclear weapon in World War II. But young people do care about the environment. And in this, I think it's important to look at the ways that this war is affecting the environment. War itself is a tremendous destructive force for the environment, and everything from the groundwater to the forests in Ukraine are being destroyed by this war. The production of weapons is so energy intensive, and we are now trying to replenish the weapons that the Pentagon has already sent to Ukraine, and so massive use of energy for weapons production. The Pentagon itself is the #1 emitter of carbon in the atmosphere, and at this time when they're on hyper production, it's even more so. And then you have the issue, for example, I don't know if you heard about the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. Let's see a show of hands if you heard about that. So some of you have. That was a pipeline that was bringing energy, gas from Russia into Germany and distributed throughout Europe, and that was blown up. If anybody wants to talk about who might have done that, I'm happy to talk about it. But the fact is that it released the largest emissions of methane gas that we have ever recorded. And then in addition to that, there is the issue that I talked about earlier on, where there is more incentive now to produce more gas and more oil and even coal to replace the energy that was coming from Russia. We even see that in Europe there were nuclear plants that were supposed to be decommissioned that are still online, and gas power and coal power plants that were already shut down that are now being fired up again. And then related to the environment, we also have to talk about the issue of where we spend our money on dealing with the issues of the climate. There was just the gathering of COP27, the gathering around the climate that happened in Egypt, and the poorer countries said that the richer countries that produce the crisis that the poorer countries are suffering from, they were supposed to have put $100 billion a year into a fund to help the poorer countries, and they never, ever fulfilled that promise. But yet, when it came to Ukraine, there was $100 billion spent in less than a year, and these countries are saying, you know, where are your priorities? Why are you so quick to put money into wars, but you won't put the money that's needed into dealing with the crisis of the climate? So I think in all of those ways are ways that affect and should be reasons that all of us are concerned about how long this war goes on.
I've lived in Eastern Europe, I've studied Eastern Europe, I'm a historian of Eastern Europe. I'm not a specialist in Eastern Europe, I've probably been there. I have to say, the way you depicted Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, and its fledgling democracy as it's come up since 2014, you superimpose swastikas on the Orange Movement. You said it was taken over by fascists.
We didn't talk about the Orange Movement. We were talking about the Maidan protests.
Okay. You glossed over the referendum in Crimea. The way you presented Ukraine and its role in this, it's a big whataboutism. That's the way it comes off to me.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. To be honest, it's from my perspective, these are the talking points that Putin used about Ukraine. There's a bunch of fascists and Nazis and neo-Nazis and attacking us precisely to invade and to kick Zelensky out.
So let me just answer some of that. And I appreciate different perspectives on here on this issue. When Zelensky came in, he came in as a peace president. He campaigned on that. He said he was going to talk to the leaders of the breakaway republic. He was going to fulfill the political side of the Minsk Accords, which was to grant autonomy to that region. As soon as he tried to do it, he was threatened by the extreme right, including saying that he would be hung from a tree if he tried to do that. As we explain in the book, the extreme right is a small percentage of the population. They got very little support for their political party, but they do have an outsized role when it comes to their imposing their will by force. And they refused to agree to leave the Donbass area. And in fact, because of their neo-Nazi ties, there have been various times in the US Congress where they passed legislation, first started by John Conyers and then by Ro Khanna, prohibiting the US for giving any kind of support to the Azov battalion. And when the US was training troops in Ukraine, it was under that caveat that they could not train and they could not give funding to the Azov battalion. Unfortunately, once the war began, they have all merged now into one force. And so there is no way to enforce the restrictions that the US has to not be supporting those small but very important neo-Nazi elements that still exist within Ukraine and have a role to play when something like a war breaks out and those who are the most militant have more power than they did before. Well, let me just say, if in the book itself, we have a lot.
Neo-Nazis, and I just think that's just my
Yeah, sure. Yeah, in the book we go quite in depth about how the neo-Nazis in Ukraine were instrumental around turning the Maidan protests from a peaceful grassroots protest into one that became very violent. And so if you're interested in learning how we talk about it in great detail there, but I appreciate your comments, and I don't want to give the impression that Ukraine is a country full of neo-Nazis. It is more about a small element that has an outside role when it comes to a conflict. Yes?
Is this Russian and Ukraine, Russia coordinating effectively a proxy war?
So the way that I view it is that there is a civil war going on that Russia got involved in, and then on top of that, there is a proxy war. And those two things are happening at the same time, which is why I think that when it comes to negotiations, it has to be on two different levels, one between Russia and Ukraine, and one between the US and Russia.
Totalitarianism.
Well, I wouldn't go as far as you are going, but I would say that there is a huge shift taking place globally, and that I listened to every speech at the Security Council of the United Nations that took place in September because I was so interested in hearing what the leaders of the world were saying. And 66 of them used their time to talk about the issue of Ukraine. They, for the most part, condemned the Russian invasion, but they also said that they did not want to take sides, that they felt that this was an issue that should be resolved within Europe, that they should not be forced to take sides, and that for them there was only one side, which is the side of peace. And that is because their people were being so affected by this war so negatively, and they just wanted the parties involved to find a way to resolve the conflict. When you talk about the US being the bully, certainly the US has a history of being a bully throughout the world. And if you take Latin America as the Russians would look at their, quote, backyard, you see that when there are any countries in Latin America in the past that have defied the US has done more than just interference economically. They have overthrown governments. We are coming up to the 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine, where the US has said for 200 years, Latin America is our backyard. We will now not allow any kind of interference. And the Russians say, look at what the US does in Latin America, and here we are surrounded by a hostile military force. Now, I don't think that justifies, because the US has done such horrible things to put in governments that it wants, doesn't justify the Russians doing something similar. But just to end on your point, the US has used economic warfare to such an extent with sanctions against countries from Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Syria, Russia, even China, that many countries around the world are fed up with that and said, on the one hand, you ask for a free market system, and on the other hand, you have all of these sanctions that you impose extraterritorially, meaning we want the rest of the world to implement the sanctions that the US puts in place. And so there are countries that are very frustrated by that, and of course trying to find alternatives to the dollar. This invasion of Russia and Ukraine is speeding up that process because Russia can now insist that it wants to be paid in rubles, and there is much more alignment of countries. But I would say, just in final answer to your question, I think what the world wants is a multipolar system. But I don't think they want a system that either is dominated by the US or is dominated by China or China and Russia. I think they want a system that is much more fluid, where the countries that were once part of a non-aligned movement would have that kind of strength in numbers and not have to follow any superpowers' mandates.
No. Major conference happens every October.
Oh, the one that happens in Russia. Yes, yes, yeah.
Question and answer session.
Yes, no, I listened to the whole thing this time. Very interesting, and I think the people in the United States should be exposed to what the Russians are talking about. I think it was a negative reflection on the US that we took Russia Today off the air, that the American people should be able to hear what the Russians are saying. We should be able to listen to the different sides and come up with our own conclusions. But if you never hear what the Russians are told to their own people or what their government is saying, then you can't understand the complexity of the conflict.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Be sure to...
Can I do one final wrap-up, just to say, if anybody is interested in learning more from the perspective that I'm coming from, you can look at my organization's website, codepink.org, but also look at one called peaceinukraine.org. And one of the initiatives that we have right now during this holiday season is to call on the faith-based leaders around this country to step up and call for a Christmas truce, like the one that happened in 1914 during the First World War. And we now have over 800 faith-based leaders, including the head of the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber, Reverend Jesse Jackson, the heads of the National Council of Churches, synagogues, mosques, that have all signed on to this call for a Christmas truce. You can see the language that we're using there, and if you know people in the religious community who might want to sign on, please look at it. Again, it's at peaceinukraine.org. Thank you.
Be sure to follow us on our social media, like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.